International political economy, which is our next topic, is about how international politics relates to international economics. So we're going to talk about a lot of international economics in these next few videos. But before we get to that, we need to talk about how governments at the state level govern their own economies. This is really important general knowledge for you to have, but it also really sets us up for the discussions that are going to come about international political economy. So how do governments shape the economy? Well, they do it a lot of ways through regulation and tax policy and so on. But at the big level, at the macro level, in terms of really trying to deal with recessions, depressions, inflation, things like that, there's essentially two tools: fiscal policy and monetary policy. So I want to explain what those are. You hear about these things a lot if you pay attention to the news, and you hear different terms. Sometimes you might hear about deficit spending. You might hear about the Fed or the Federal Reserve Board cutting interest rates. You might hear about people getting stimulus checks. These things and a lot of others are different ways of talking about fiscal and monetary policy. So a couple of definitions. Fiscal policy essentially is about manipulating the general level of demand in the economy by increasing or decreasing government spending. Monetary policy is also about manipulating the amount of demand in the economy by increasing or decreasing interest rates, and related to that, by expanding or contracting the money supply. Don't worry, I'm going to explain how all of this works. So the basic issue then that both of these things do is they get at what we call aggregate demand, which is the overall level of demand in an economy. Because the problem that we're usually most concerned with is recession. And that's a situation where aggregate demand falls. That's another way of saying firms and individuals start spending less money. And if people start spending less money, then it really creates a sort of theoretical problem that if demand doesn't meet supply, there's unused resources in the economy. But the bigger issue really is what those unused resources are, because essentially when demand falls, companies can't sell goods, they start laying people off. And unused labor or laid off labor, that means unemployment. And it's not only that it's inefficient in the economic sense, but it's a huge social welfare problem. And for politicians, it's a gigantic political problem, right? When unemployment's high, people tend to vote out the incumbents. And in particular, what governments are trying to prevent is deflation, this self-reinforcing cycle. If we think inflation is bad, then it would sound like deflation is good. But it actually is extremely dangerous. And let me explain how this happened basically in Riverside in the housing market in 2009, which was the last big recession we had in this country before the COVID crisis. Essentially, housing prices went way up. People were spending a lot of money on houses, and they were borrowing money to do it, right? At some point, a couple of things happened. One is the price of houses stopped going up, right? And that meant you could no longer sell a house maybe for what you thought you were going to be able to. And related to that, the economy did what the economy does from time to time, which is starts to shrink a little bit. Well, but because prices were so high and people had borrowed so much money, the housing market then became very sensitive to any downturn in the economy. So what happens if a few people get unemployed? They say, oh, I can't make my house payment, I'm going to sell my house. So now what happens to the value of housing? It decreases. So now you have a lot of people who have spent a lot of money on a house and are paying a lot of money in loan payments on a house, and now all of a sudden they're what we call underwater. The house is worth less than they owe on it. And so what do they want to do? They want to sell. Well, that drives prices down even further, right? Not only that, but the people who now if the value of their house has gone down, essentially that's where a lot of people have their wealth stored, is in their house. So if the value of your house goes down, you feel less wealthy. And what do you do then? You spend less. So that takes even more demand out of the economy, and even more people get laid off. So it might seem like a good thing if the price of houses go down, then it's easier for people to buy houses. But in fact, what this did was create this self-reinforcing cycle that was driving the whole economy down the tubes. And of course, many, many people lost their jobs, lost their homes, and went through immense hardship. So this is a bad thing. So the flip side of that, and a problem that we haven't had recently in this country, partly because of government policy, is the opposite, which is the economy is growing so fast that there is so much money chasing goods and labor that the supply of goods and labor can't keep up with the increased demand, and prices go up. That's called inflation. And when we think of inflation in terms of the wages we get paid, that sounds like a good thing, and in a lot of ways it is. But if everybody is paying more for everything, one of the things that does is it makes our savings worth less money, right? If we have a certain amount of savings, but the price of everything is going up, that means that in real terms, the value of our savings is going down. And so people who've saved for a long time, especially retired people, tend to become impoverished. Anybody whose wages are not growing as fast as the prices are growing is essentially losing ground. It's, again, particularly hard on people on pensions, but actually this tends to be true for most workers as well. So neither high inflation, rapid growth in the economy, nor contraction of the economy is a good thing. What you want is something in between. And that's essentially what fiscal and monetary policy aim to do, is tame things when growth is too fast so that they don't crash and give you the opposite problem. How do they do this? Well, fiscal policy does it essentially through the government budget. And we've seen a lot of this in the last few years, especially during the COVID pandemic. There's basically the idea that the government is just going to send people checks. So, but it hasn't increased our taxes. In fact, in the Trump administration, we had decreases in taxes. So if the government increases spending with taxes the same, or keeps spending the same but cuts taxes, right, it's essentially putting more money into the economy through spending than it's taking out through taxes. And all that money either comes to us in the form of stimulus checks, or the government might use it to build new buildings, which means they're hiring construction workers. Any way you slice it, it's injecting demand into the economy. And that means more money to chase after goods and labor, so prices tend to recover, people get put back to work. Now, in the long run, you can't run massive government deficits forever, because in the long run, when the government borrows money, right, if the government's spending more than it's taking in, it's borrowing money. It does that through issuing bonds. And in the long run, this can be a problem. Right now, in the United States, there's actually a pretty big debate among the economists, because we've actually borrowed a lot more money and are borrowing a lot more money than the historic collective wisdom of the economists would have said is viable. The proposal that Joe Biden had sort of on the table as he became president was for $1.4 trillion in additional spending. And the idea was throw this into the economy for two reasons, right? One is because people need it, right? At sort of at the micro level, it helps people pay their bills during the pandemic. But the other is that by increasing the overall amount of demand in the economy, it will prevent a recession or a worse recession resulting from the pandemic economy, right? You can do the opposite in an overheated economy, which is if the economy is heating up too much, the government can simply increase taxes, take more money out of people's pockets, or it can cut spending. This, I have to say, very rarely happens because tax increases and spending cuts are very unpopular. And so fiscal policy really tends to be politically palatable only in one direction, and that's one of its real weaknesses. Monetary policy does something completely different. This happens not through government spending, which in most countries has to go through a whole legislative process, but it's carried out by central banks, who, on the contrary, tend to be insulated from day-to-day political pressures. Central bankers are not elected. And some people think this is good, some people think it's bad. But basically what they're doing is shaping aggregate demand by interest rates and by shaping the money supply. Interest rates are pretty simple. When interest rates are lower, we want to borrow and spend more, right? If interest rates are really low, I'm more likely to buy a new car, or even if I'm going to buy a new car, I might buy a more expensive car, because now I'm spending less money on the loan, I can spend more money on the car. So lower interest rates tend to stimulate the economy. The flip side is, when the economy is growing too quickly, the Federal Reserve can increase the interest rates at which it loans money to banks, right? The Fed doesn't lend money directly to us, but it lends to the big banks. And when it pushes those rates up, those rate increases get passed on. We will tend to borrow less, right, or spend less because more of our money is going to repayment. And so that's a destimulus. And really over the last 50 years in the United States, that's the kind of aggregate demand management that's really been dominant, is the Federal Reserve increasing and decreasing interest rates, which is why every time there's an increase or decrease in interest rates, it's big news. Something they've done more recently during the last recession, the one that began in 2008, and they've continued to do, is to emit more currency. Basically, it's just printing money and then using that money to buy things with it. The government can simply buy securities, which puts money in the hands of the people that bought the securities or sold the securities, or they could do other things. But basically, pushing money into the economy, which is inherently inflationary in the sense that if you've got the same amount of goods but more dollars chasing them, that's going to drive prices up, and then, of course, put money in people's pockets so they go spend more, and hopefully the economy recovers. The reason central banks have responded to emitting more currency, which is a very non-traditional way of stimulating the economy, is because during the last recession, they did all the interest rate cutting they could. Basically, they cut rates and cut rates and cut rates to try to stimulate the economy, and interest rates got to be basically zero. And once interest rates are zero, it's pretty hard to move them below zero. It's basically you're paying money, you're paying people to take money off your hands, and that's just as crazy. So once interest rates have gotten pushed to zero, the only way you can stimulate the economy through monetary policy is to emit more currency. The danger of that, of course, is it is inherently inflationary and things can get out of hand. So far, they haven't. So what are the strengths and weaknesses? I've kind of hinted at this already, so I'll go through this quickly. The virtues of monetary policy are this, is that central banks are insulated from political pressure. They're run by usually PhD economists with a mission of keeping inflation within a certain rate, and they're actually pretty good at doing that. You might recall that during the Trump administration, especially as it was getting close to election time, Donald Trump was putting immense pressure on the Federal Reserve to stimulate the economy because he believed, correctly probably, that a stimulated economy would help his re-election chances. And the Federal Reserve basically said, well, we'll do what we think is best for the economy. So that political insulation is seen as being a virtue, although others will criticize it for being not really very democratic. Monetary policy creates no debt. And that's important because debt can be a real problem for governments in the long term. We'll talk in a future class about debt crises. And monetary policy can be implemented very quickly. Interest rate changes will change economic behavior more or less overnight. Banks immediately will start lending more money and so on. Whereas government spending, it takes a long time. Even if the government decides it's going to spend money, the government has to write contracts, the government has to put programs in place, and it can sometimes take a very long time to spend the money. The downsides of monetary policy are that it does have a limit, which I referred to. Once you've pushed interest rates down to zero, you can't do that normal kind of monetary stimulus anymore, and then you have to either print money or shift to fiscal policy. And one of the reasons why there's been a sort of rebirth of fiscal policy in recent years is because we have run up against some of the limits of monetary policy. The other problem with monetary policy, and there's a lot of debate about this, but I think this is an important point to make even if people disagree about it. A lot of people are going to argue that monetary policy, because it works in terms of money being, interest rates being lowered for financial firms or money being pushed into financial firms, that's kind of where the biggest benefit goes. So that during the monetary policy, the monetary stimulus during the Great Recession, the Wall Street banks made a lot of money. In order for the effects to sort of trickle down to the average schmoes like you and me, it takes a long time, and there's a real question as to how much of the benefit of a monetary stimulus ends up with the people who need it most as opposed to the people who need it least. In contrast, fiscal policy can in some cases go straight to those who need it, right? When the government simply says we're going to give everybody a $600 tax credit or we're going to write you a $1,400 stimulus check, that money can oftentimes be put in people's pocket within a matter of days. So that's a form of fiscal policy that's faster, but more to the point, right? It skips all the bankers and everybody else and gives the money right to the people who need it most. And so that's seen as being a big benefit. For those of you who are into the economic side of things, I'm just going to put the graph here. I know that the graphs will sort of scare some people, but essentially this vertical line refers to basically the supply of goods and services in the economy at any given point in time. And so point one here, this red box in the middle, is sort of an economy that's in the right kind of equilibrium because supply and demand are equaling the amount of goods in the economy. During a recession, what happens is demand goes down, and that's this line that kind of is going from the upper left to the lower right. Demand goes down, and so the goal is, through government spending or through monetary policy, to increase demand so that all this revenue in this triangle is not lost, right? Essentially, the shrink in the economy that is represented by the stuff that's not being done below this equilibrium point, that's basically seen as just deadweight economic loss. And the idea is to get the economy back to that point. The flip side is when you get into situation number two here, there's too much money chasing a given amount of goods, and it's driving inflation up. And so the idea is to take some demand out of the economy, bring it back down to equilibrium. If you've taken a course in macroeconomics, that's pretty straightforward. If not, don't worry too much about it. But I did want to just give some graphic representation. This is how the economists do things. So the big question, right? So far, in this whole video so far, I haven't said anything about international politics or economics. The question I want to get at is what happens when all of those policies that I've just talked about, those are things that are done by national governments within the jurisdiction of national governments, right? National economies. But we know that economies these days are not national. They are globalized. And so the question I want to ask about is what happens when you're sort of doing national level solutions to problems that are often global? How do those two different levels connect up? And we're going to talk about that a lot more in the coming lectures.